So Edwin Fernandez from the chat had a great question that I think kind of relates to some of the things you were talking about. How do you navigate the decision process of abstracting a process or set of processes out of your project and making it open source? And I think part of that decision-making process are some of the things that most people wouldn't think about. The admin stuff you're going to have to get into and the dealing with other people. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, it's interesting because that abstraction process is like the hardest part. That's like the first step where I was talking about. I had these where I added fields to my user model. Step one was like, okay, if I'm going to make this open source, we'll just have the gem require these things and we'll keep like the process the same. But obviously that doesn't work out very well when it's a third-party library. It's one thing to do that and add fields in your own code and maintain that. But when you're doing it from a library, you have to realize like that stuff needs to be much more modular and separate from the main code base that you're integrating with. So a lot of the decisions now are, if I'm going to implement something, how do I make it so it's not going to break in the future and overthink any database changes. So like the last stuff that I've generally done, in an effort to hopefully prevent lots of migration things in the future, is like take good advantage of JSON columns now so that we can add new things like tax support without migration. So we can just shove things into the JSON column, and a lot of that stuff we don't need to query. If we did need to query it, we'd probably more consider adding a field. But for that stuff, it is easier for us to go upgrade the gem and say, hey, we now support taxes and you didn't have to run any migrations and whatever. So those are a lot of things that you'd probably just run the migrations yourself. But in a library, you're trying to avoid those complicated steps that are going to cause issues for upgrading, where everybody wants the latest version of the gem in their gem file. So they're like, okay, just changed from version 4 to version 5, but everything's broken now. And that's the thing you have to deal with, is like, how do you provide a clean set of steps to upgrade between every version, especially if there are any major changes? And that is the hard part. Deprecations, you need to know in Rails what is going to happen in Rails version 8. So Rails version 7.1 can start telling people, hey, you shouldn't use this because it's eventually going to get removed in 2 years. And that's some crazy stuff too. I'm not going that far out with pay or anything, but there's things you have to start thinking about when you're building open source stuff. And the abstractions of the processes are one thing where you're like, I don't know how this is going to be used anymore. Building a library, so I have to think about every possibility of how it could be used and plan for that, which makes decisions very, very hard in comparison. Where if you're building a feature for your boss and they give you a set of requirements, voila, you can, base your decisions off of that. But with pay, we're like, well, I don't know what Stripe's going to come out with next or whoever. And maybe we'll add another payment processor to the mix and support that too. So what if they have features that the others don't? How do we support that and still give a standardized way to interact with most of them? Like a good example is Stripe and Braintree allow you to create a customer record through the API. Paddle does not. Paddle, you use JavaScript, and that talks to their API, creates a customer, and we just have to listen to a webhook to sync it back. And that's a weird difference between them all, which end up changing like the code for pay to be totally different for those reasons, because it was like, well, we don't even have the customer stuff anymore. So
talking about esoteric things.
Oh yeah.
So some of what these payment gateways do compared to like a Braintree or Stripe are quite different. So yeah, I totally understand where you're coming from with that.
Yeah, that is that sounds awful. I'm already like, we have these 3 or 4 and I'm trying to pare them down. and I want less, and I can't imagine doing 10. That sounds awful.
Well, actually, it's gotten pretty fast now if we have a new customer that comes to us, hey, can you support ABC123 gateway? We're like, all right, well, we'll take a look at it, and
Yeah, now you have the interface defined the way you want it, and you know that like as long as they support these 3 things, then we can implement that. And that's one of those things that you learn over time. You can't just like jump in and have that ready ahead of time. You build the first 3 or 4, and then you're like, okay, this is the standard, abstraction around them. So that's good. Like
you still get the curveballs, but you try to minimize them.
Yeah, and there are always exceptions. It's always going to be that where, for example, like with Stripe, we have to create payment intents and setup intents ahead of collecting payment information for SCA now. And like we don't necessarily have to do that for the other ones. So we have exceptions in the code all over where it's like, well, it's Stripe, so we'll go create this before we display the page. And it is what it is. But yeah, it is it's a really interesting challenge, and one that like if you want to learn how to go build an abstraction around something, go find a couple APIs that are similar and try and make an interface that treats them all the same. For example, Stripe allows you to switch between monthly and yearly subscriptions. Braintree does not. So you have to calculate, you have to cancel the subscription, calculate how much credit you're going to prorate onto the other one, and then give them a discount when they subscribe to the other one. And like, you'll have fun, doing those things and really like getting an idea of like, okay, now I got an understanding of how to think about making these a standard interface that I work with. And that's probably the biggest thing that I think people would learn is thinking about your interfaces. What are my public methods? What are my private methods? And like, what do I want people to know and interact with? What are the arguments for those? And defining that in stone is very helpful, because then even in Ruby, we still need those interfaces to be defined. They don't need to be formally defined like you might in Java or whatever, but you still need that packed so that users know what they can do, and plugins and whatever else, same thing. So yeah.
If you like this clip and want to watch another one, you can click right here, or if you want to watch the full video, you can click here.